You're listening to Winnipeg's Classic 107. My name is Simon Rusnak. The Manitoba Chamber Orchestra's milestone 50th season continues, welcoming another ensemble celebrating a golden anniversary, the Winnipeg Singers. Uniting to perform a Bach Lutheran Mass, the MCO will also perform an orchestral suite of Bach and music of George Frederick Handel, all led by conductor Alexander Weimann. I'm thrilled to say the renowned ensemble director, keyboardist, and collaborator has joined me this morning to chat a little bit more about the program. Welcome to Winnipeg's Classic 107 and welcome back to the city.
Good morning, Simon. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by starting here. How does it feel to be back in Winnipeg?
It's great. It may feel awkward to hear that, but in Vancouver, we were deprived of rain and even of temperatures that were lower than slightly uncomfortable warm, I have to say. And so I welcome the weather. You may be sad about it, but for me, it's a welcome change. And of course, I'm thrilled to work with that wonderful orchestra, and also new to me, a wonderful choir.
Well, I'm so excited to hear that you're not only enjoying the weather, but also this opportunity that presents itself to be here in this celebratory year for the MCO. And of course, you've collaborated with them before, sometimes conducting, sometimes playing, sometimes doing both at the same time, as you often do. In anniversary years, we celebrate, but we also look back to the past and reminisce. That has me wondering, do you remember when you first worked with the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra?
Yeah, I do. I don't remember the year, but it was with a wonderful trumpet player, Guy, who came. I think he also more regularly plays with the orchestra, and we did Brandenburg 2 and a few other pieces, a Neruda concerto with him. I remember that, and I also remember the last time I came, which was quite fresh into the pandemic. And I also remember coming to Manitoba, I had to self-isolate for 2 weeks. So that's one of those memories that will stick with me as the pandemic will stick with all of us.
Yeah, that Guy Fiu concert, I remember that from a few years back. It was about 5 years ago. Just a great performance that you led. He's such a phenomenal player. And then, as you mentioned, those online concerts, we heard you conducting music of Haydn, amongst other works. It's always a pleasure to have you back in Winnipeg. It is such a fruitful partnership between you and the MCO, and you bring such a wealth of experience as a soloist, as a conductor, and especially when it comes to the Baroque, given your extensive resume, working and playing with ensembles around the world. Most recently, as you mentioned, Early Music Vancouver. You serve as artistic director of the Pacific Baroque Orchestra, amongst so many other commitments. So just before we get chatting in a little bit more detail about the music on this program, I'm wondering if you could speak more broadly to Bach and Handel, because you're no stranger to these two fellows and their music. What is it about these two that makes them so special?
A simple and wonderful question, probably difficult to answer. Bach, I think I speak for a lot of my colleagues too, is really the reason for me to be in music. So he's that figure that early on, or from the beginning, fascinated me and never stopped doing that. Thank you for your very kind words. I think I do know a bit of Handel and Bach. There is always much more that I don't know, obviously. But both, I don't feel like I've come close to understanding them really in that way that they would stop surprising me. So the Lutheran Mass that we work on and perform tonight is also, though I'm so familiar with Bach, I like to think a riddle in many ways for me. As in, to give you one example, he would choose sad and mournful music for words like adoramus, glorificamus. We adore you, we glorify you. What does he want to tell us with that? It's just it keeps being a challenge really to work with that music, and maybe that's part of why it did not fall into oblivion as so many other pieces did.
Yeah, it is hard to articulate. I know it's such a simple question, and I'm sure it's one of those that people ask, many times over, but it's always curious to hear how people articulate what that is. And like you say, there's always this sense of discovery in the music of Bach. And if you're just tuning in, my name is Simon Rasnak. I'm chatting with Alexander Weimann in town to conduct the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra. The concert features the Winnipeg Singers, who together with the MCO perform one of the Bach Lutheran Masses. There's 4 of them in total. Very beautiful works, but sort of, as you say, very perplexing works too, aren't they? Because we really don't know why Bach wrote these masses.
That's right, and there are the 4 that we usually talk about, but in a way, even the big sibling, the B minor mass, in its origin, it's the same thing. It's just a Kyrie and Gloria, and then Bach later, quite late in his life, and also we don't know why, really added what we would call the Credo, the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei. That Kyrie Gloria, of course, is, and that's why we refer to it as a Lutheran Mass, is what he would usually need for the service with no Eucharist, as it's called, and no communion, and it's really interesting to look at these pieces because he uses a lot of material that he has used in cantatas or other vocal pieces before. A very common practice at the time, where people did not want to be or couldn't afford to be wasteful, really. A little bit like today again. And a very interesting thing is that Bach would never just reuse material. He would always tailor it and accommodate it and work on it, improve it if you want. And those slight changes actually give us a very interesting insight in his technique, if you want. Not his artistry. That we never understand, but his technique is interesting enough.
As you say, I mean, these would have been functional parts of the Lutheran Mass, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the first 2 parts, but also a bit of a misnomer because there isn't really anything particularly Lutheran about the Masses. They're sort of Missa Brevis. They're these sort of Kyrie, Gloria Masses, short Mass settings. Just because there are the 2 characters, the Kyrie and then the second part, Gloria, can you sort of discuss those 2 characters and how the chorus works into all of this?
Yeah, great question, because especially in this piece, the 2 are quite complementary. So the Kyrie is very peaceful. The words, Lord have mercy, are set in what we would call old style. And by that I mean polyphony. So the idea of 4 very independent parts that are all connected through the same material, but they don't sing it at the same time and in the same rhythm. So it's a very masterful technique of putting various parts into one fabric, into one texture. Counterpoint is the word for that. And the Kyrie really reflects that style. It also quotes an old German chorale melody that is oddly put for horns and oboes in unison. And those 2 instruments, I don't know any other example actually in music history at that time where that would happen. Those 2 instruments create a very ancient sound, and it almost feels like a voice from the past that we hear. Very interesting effect. So the Kyrie, you could say, is really looking back, and the Gloria is the sheer opposite. It's very Baroque in the sense that it's festive, magnificent, interesting in its structure, and all the parts, the horns, the oboes, the strings, are all very independent and very virtuosic, and in what we call a concerto. So in some sort of competition, or at the same time actually conversation. So it's a very interesting thing, and the choir in that movement has an incredibly difficult score to master, because all the voices are really treated as instruments, which Bach likes to do. He sometimes feels almost a little relentless or merciless that way.
You know, I was listening to a past interview you gave, and you talked about how you sort of feel like Bach is a keyboardist at heart. You know, maybe not the harpsichord, but at the organ, and then that comes through in his music. And I mean, it is challenging for singers, but it is so masterful in the writing. It makes sense once you wrap your head around it. And I mean, I'm really appreciative of how you kind of describe the Kyrie as that old style a la Palestrina. It sounds like something that could have been heard back then. And then always to me, it feels like the Gloria. It's like the heavens open up, and we're seeing what could be. I mean, it is just absolutely timeless music, a real pearl and a delight. And the one other thing that I just want to point out, as you mentioned, the horns. This the only of the Lutheran masses that have the horns, and it's just a wonderful part, isn't it?
Wonderful, absolutely. And it's actually the first time that I perform that piece. I've done all the other ones, but never this, for some strange reason. And yeah, as you point out, the horns are really the glorious instruments anyways, right? And fantastic players in the orchestra. Really, as you may know, horns are always an entity of awe in any kind of orchestra, and it has to do with their part and that incredibly that fragility of the instrument. And yeah, it's I don't even have words. You know, it's really a joy to have that team in the orchestra, and to have that material to bring to sound. It's really wonderful.
It is going to be a grand concert, a celebratory concert. And of course, this Bach Lutheran Mass, the first in F, is bookended by some suites, an orchestral suite by Bach, and also a water music suite of George Frederick Handel. We don't really have too much longer, but just briefly, the water music suite of Handel. What can you say about this one? I mean, there's so many things.
Yeah, again, I think it's just the imagination in his use of instruments, in particular the woodwinds and the horns, again with the strings. Also the variety of movements, though they are all dance movements in one way or the other. It's really, for me, it's always a miracle how quickly those 20 some minutes or so go by for those suites. For the Handel, I have changed the order of movements a little bit to what one may be used to, and we end with a glorious minuet with the horns. Yeah, the Handel is really a jewel, and so I think it's the Bach. The first suite is they are all wonderful, and thinking that probably most of Bach's orchestra writing is lost, like most of his cantatas are, or passions, and so on. What we have in those four orchestral suites, or the Brandenburg concertos, or the solo concertos, of course, is just glorious. And again, to be able to do it with such a superb group of musicians, for the winds and the strings, is yeah, I think it's the best answer we can do in what we love so much in response to the occasion.
Well, absolutely magnificent. It is a pleasure to have you back here in Winnipeg. Alexander, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me at Classic 107 today.
Thank you very much. Thanks.